Welcome. Welcome to the 15th annual Raymond Beecher Lecture at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. I'm the chair of the Board of Trustees, Lisa Fox Martin, and I thank you for joining us today and registering to hear what promises to be a fascinating talk about our new Thomas Cole painting. So I'm here to introduce you to Betsy Jacks, our executive director, who will introduce our speaker for today. And thank you so much for registering and for joining us. And enjoy the talk. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lisa. And hello, everyone. I'm Betsy Jacks, Executive Director of the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. And thank you for joining this year's Raymond Beecher Lecture. Ray was the man who led the charge to turn the Thomas Cole site into a museum over 20 years ago. And I'm so grateful that I had the privilege of knowing this extraordinary man. Graham Boettcher is the R. Hugh Daniel Director of the Birmingham Museum of Art in Alabama. He arrived there in 2006 and moved quickly up the ranks from postdoctoral fellow, then curator of American art, chief curator, then deputy director, until they finally made him director in 2017. Tonight, Graham will be talking with us about a major painting by Thomas Cole that was recently gifted to us by our newest board member, Susan Warner. She and her late husband, Jack, assembled one of the very finest collections of American art anywhere. And through the Warner Foundation, she is continuing his legacy of teaching American history through American art. I'm so grateful I got to know this extraordinary woman, Susan. Graham is delighted to be returning to his roots for his lecture today. While at Yale for his doctorate, Graham served as research assistant to Tim Berenger, the great professor of American art, whom many of you will know. He's been working with us on lectures, exhibitions, and other projects for over a decade. Luckily for Graham, when he was at Yale, Tim was just then curating American Sublime, which opened at Tate Britain in 2002. And Graham wrote entries for the catalog. Graham was one of the three major scholars that we were to feature at our scholars dinner this past April before the pandemic interrupted our plans. So we're absolutely thrilled he could join us tonight. So please give Graham Boettcher a warm welcome virtually to tonight's program.
Thank you, Betsy, for that very kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be with everyone this evening. I wish we could be together in person, but one of the silver linings of Zoom is that we can be anywhere in the world and still be together. So it is really, truly a pleasure and an honor to be with all of you this evening. As Betsy alluded to, this talk is returning to my roots in many ways. I discovered the glories of the Hudson River School sort of late in my undergraduate experience. I was a German studies major but took a survey course the second semester of my senior year with Jules Prown, and it opened my eyes to all things American, but especially the Hudson River School. And I was struck, being a German studies major, by the similarities between the American landscape painters of the 19th century and the work of their German counterparts, and devoted myself to studying that when I was working on my master's thesis. Like Betsy said, after I returned to Yale, I had the privilege of working with Tim Berenger, assisting him with research on the American Sublime show. What Betsy didn't share is that I often think of those biographies that I wrote for the catalog as the most English biographies of American artists ever written. I included every time they saw a work by Turner or Constable, and every time they met Ruskin or Queen Victoria. So a very different sort of biography of American artists. Now, the subject of this evening's talk is of particularly personal significance to me. For a number of reasons, not only the return to my roots, but moreover because of the donor of this work, and her husband, the great collector, Jack Warner. I would have been privileged to know Jack and Susan since my arrival in Alabama in 2006. Indeed, that's knowing that I would have the chance to work with the Warners on their collection was one of the several things that enticed me to come south directly from Yale after receiving my doctorate. I had the pleasure of working with Jack and Susan, curating various exhibitions, having a lot of fun. Here's Jack posing with Hunters in a Landscape, and you can see in the background another or several of his other Thomas Coles, a bumper crop of Thomas Coles, including Falls of the Catterskill, 1826, A View of Catskill Mountain House, completed in 1848, and Indian at Sunset, completed in 1847 in the lower right. And Jack sadly passed away in February of 2017 at the age of 99 years old. He lived a rich and storied life. And as Betsy mentioned, Dr. Susan Austin Warner, his wife, carries on his legacy, and in particularly important to Jack was using American art as a means of educating people about American history, which was very important to him. I will say that Jack and I used to have a lot of fun. Here we are celebrating the 225th anniversary of the surrender at Yorktown, I'm dressed as Alexander Hamilton. He's dressed as George Washington, though I think maybe we look more like Mozart and Bach, if I'm being honest. But hey, those are the costumes that we could find here in Birmingham. But the other thing I'll mention is that Jack was a very, very practical individual, and he often mustered visitors to his museum, including myself, into service to rehang the collection, because he used the works of art in the collection, which were hundreds in numbers, to create stories and to make narratives, and was responsible for some of the most interesting juxtapositions. And so the painting that's the subject of tonight's talk, I feel confident that I carried across a room at least a half a dozen times over the years of knowing Jack and Susan. And I sometimes have a little, kind of mischievous, take a little mischievous glee in telling museum directors and curators who now have works in their collection from the Warner collection, oh, I once carried your painting across the room, or I remember hanging that, which usually surprises them. So the painting, Hunters in a Landscape, is a painting, I would venture to say it's one of the most significant paintings by Cole about which the least has been written. Really the only significant thing that has been written to date about the painting is the 2003 essay that accompanied the painting when it appeared at auction at Christie's. And it's primarily a descriptive essay, and it situates the painting mostly in the tradition of American landscape up to that point, Cole's inheritance from English counterparts, and kind of looks at the compositional structure of the painting. But it doesn't really go much further. There are some auction catalog essays that are very, very scholarly, written by some of the leading scholars in the field. This is an excellent essay, but it does leave the reader wanting more. And that, in an effort to provide that something more, I'm going to take you on a bit of an adventure this evening. So these are thoughts that are brand new and the product of my research, but and also derived in part from the excellent research of other major scholars of Thomas Cole's work, Alan Wallach, who deserves special mention, and Tim Berenger, and others, Kevin Avery. So I've been really reading up and returning to Cole in preparation for tonight's talk, but I if you will indulge me, we're going to go on a little bit of a ride from discussing everything from Rip Van Winkle to cabbage. And you'll see where that leads us. So the painting is set in the Catskills. It was one of Cole's earliest, completed in 1825. It is not entirely clear what painting this corresponds to, if any, on the checklist or inventory of his early works in his own hand. There are two paintings listed as composition, which this might correspond to, but there's nothing that gives us enough description on that list that we could say definitively matches with Hunter's in a landscape. We do not even know that Hunter's in a landscape is its original title. It's a discursive title. The title Two Men Walking has also been used, and I learned that thanks to Kate Mencaneri, the curator at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. There's an alternate title on the back, but in either case, I think both are descriptive, and we don't really have a sense of how this was titled originally yet. Perhaps additional research by Kate and others will reveal that. But one of the things that has always struck me about this work, and it's a work that I became familiar with immediately upon arriving in Alabama in 2006. It was acquired by the Warner Collection in 2003, so already hanging in the Westervelt Warner Museum of Art when I arrived for my first visit in that fall in 2006. The thing that immediately struck me is the difference between the two figures. Yes, this is a incredible landscape with all the hallmarks of Thomas Cole's work, but my eyes were immediately drawn to the two figures for a number of reasons. Now, one temptation is to perhaps identify one or the other figures, perhaps most readily the one on the left, with Thomas Cole himself. As I think many of you already know, Thomas Cole is rather well known for inserting himself in his works, but typically as an artist, sitting in nature, practicing his craft. Examples of this are the Oxbow of 1836 and Catskill Mountain House, which I'll speak on just a bit later. I'll leave it up to you whether or not you think one or either of the figures resembles Thomas Cole enough to make that leap, but I'll put it out there for your consideration. And you can use the work on the left, which is Cole's only proper portrait as portrait that he painted, of self-portrait as portrait that he painted in his lifetime. But moreover, I think what strikes me about these figures is the fact that they seem rather mismatched. Only one of them really seems to be a woodsman, or at least a woodsman that we would think of in traditional terms. Now, the figure on the left, to be sure, resembles, I think, rather closely another figure that dates from precisely the same period as this painting, which is Thomas Cole's drawing of Rip Van Winkle, which, as I said, dates from 1825, that or thereabouts, and descended in his family and was ultimately given by his granddaughter, Florence Cole Vincent, to the Albany Institute of History and Art in New York. It's that you can see the hat, the coat, which the gentleman in the painting is carrying, but you can see the many brass buttons and the sort of a kerchief around his neck. Very similar manner of dress. I also think that the manner of dress is rather similar to naval uniforms at that time. I'm showing you an image, to be sure, that is English. It dates from around 1827, and it shows the actor Thomas Potter Cook as Jack Sykes in the play Nelson. And Jack Sykes, as a historical figure, was Lord Nelson's favorite coxswain, or what we might say, bosun's mate. And for those of you who wonder, well, why is this art historian showing me an English naval uniform when we're talking about an American picture? I did some research into this, and according to historians of naval uniforms, there was a high degree, pun intended, of uniformity between British and American naval uniforms in the early 19th century. And so often, because there are relatively few images depicting American uniforms, except for portraits of ranking officers, they look more broadly at material culture, visual culture on both sides of the pond, and can often find clues about what American uniforms looked like at the time by looking at their English counterparts. So I don't know necessarily whether I would suggest that this individual should be read as a sailor in the woods, except to say that I think there's certain things about his manner of dress that stand out. Now, what about the figure on the right? The figure on the right, I think, more closely resembles someone we would expect to see in the woods. And as a means of comparison, I show you a painting that Cole completed just a year later, his picture of Daniel Boone, and which is today at the Mead Art Museum at Amherst College. But I think we could see, I'll go back a second, you know, kind of that's what we generally think of a woodsman as looking like. So what's going on here? Well, what I'd like to suggest is that perhaps what Cole had in mind by including two figures so greatly contrasted is that he might have been trying to suggest something similar to what one finds in William Sidney Mount's After Dinner, which was painted less than a decade later, in which you have a violinist in the center, which is a stand-in for Mount himself. It compares very favorably with an early self-portrait of Mount. And those of you who know Mount's work know that he was a violinist himself. But the figure, or Mount himself, uses music to bring together two individuals of clearly diverse socioeconomic stations, a top-hatted gentleman and a cigar-smoking man wearing a red Monmouth cap, which identifies him in the costume of the day as a laborer, or more specifically, a commercial sailor. Now, Cole's thoughts on democracy are, or at least in the Jacksonian sense, are very well documented by Alan Wallach in his essay, Thomas Cole, Landscape and the Course of American Empire, from the 1994 exhibition catalog, Thomas Cole, Landscape into History. And I'll just read to you briefly a quote, passage from Alan Wallach's essay. He wrote, "In Cole's mythic historical scenario, each stage implied the next. The trackless wilderness would be explored, cleared, and settled. Log cabins would be built only to be replaced by prosperous farmhouses. As in an epic drama, the sequence seemed preordained. History moved from lower to higher, from barbarism and savagery to increasingly advanced stages of civilization. But was this history preordained? Would the march of civilization, as Cole and his middle-class contemporaries saw it, continue in America? These questions deeply troubled him. The Jacksonian gospel of progress, which celebrated democracy and improvement, had no appeal for him." End quote. So it is, you know, that much we know is that Cole really bristled at the idea of progress, at least defined in Jackson's time, and the idea of the democratization of the country and appealing to the masses. But I would like to submit that perhaps for Cole, the woods provided its own form of democracy, or maybe more specifically, a democratizing influence, bringing together people irrespective of rank, that the wilderness was a sort of great equalizer, equal to the aspirations of any democracy. Now, another unmistakable element in the painting is are the anthropomorphic tree trunks that almost seem to be dancing with or chasing one another. And formally in structure, I think they resemble the pair of hunters very, very closely. If you trace the lines, they're very, very close. Perhaps even a sort of a twinning effect is in place. The expressive and nearly human qualities of Cole's trees are among, I think, those of you who are devotees of Cole's work, they are among his chief hallmarks, and we find them emerging in his earliest works, even his graphic works, as you can see here in this drawing on the right from 1823. This animated approach to the natural world can certainly be attributed in part to the romantic imagination as it was understood in the late 18th and early 19th century. But for Cole, the human-like qualities of his trees may have a more specific meaning. As he once wrote, trees are like men, differing widely in character, in sheltered spots or under the influence of culture. They show few contrasting points. Peculiarities are pruned and trained away until there is a general resemblance. But in exposed situations, wild and uncultivated, battling with the elements and with one another for the possession of a morsel of soil or a favoring rock to which they may cling, they exhibit striking peculiarities and sometimes a grand originality. So in some ways, this passage sort of, bucks against the equalizing influence of democracy, underscoring a belief that even in situations that would call out for a sort of sameness, that the individuality sometimes wins out. As one of Cole's earliest paintings, Hunters in a Landscape may be further understood if taken into consideration in the context of a contemporaneous landscape completed the same year, perhaps worked on at the same time, and that is Landscape with Dead Trees, Catskill, completed in 1825, today in the collection of the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin. This painting was purchased in the fall of 1825 for just $25 by the author, actor, playwright, sometime painter, and historian William Dunlap, who wrote the first history of American art in 1834, entitled The History of the Rise and Progress of the Arts of Design in the United States. It very shortly thereafter entered the collection of Philip Hone, who became the mayor of New York City in 1826. I would like to propose to you this evening that we think of the two paintings, Hunter in a Landscape and Landscape with Dead Trees, as pendants, as episodes in a single narrative. And we know that Thomas Cole is quite given to narrative paintings. We have The Voyage of Life, we have The Course of Empire, we have the Knight's Departure and Return. But unlike The Voyage of Life, in which the narrative unfolds over a lifetime, or The Course of Empire, which charts the rise and fall of an entire civilization over many, many years, here we have things unfolding in a rather different sense of time. It's sort of in real time. We have the hunters going into the forest, and then we see their intended prey. What this painting, though, has in common with The Course of Empire, though, is a single rock edifice bearing witness to the scene unfolding before it. And we can, that rock edifice, which we have in the background of this work and of Hunters in the Landscape, is none other than Round Top in the Catskill Mountains, seen in this close-up view from 1827, now in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So imagine that the deer moving across the foreground are in fact being pursued by these two hunters from the other painting. And in fact, one deer, the deer in the center of the composition, appears to pause and listen as if being pursued, while the other is in full flight. This is in terms of drama, in media res, into the middle of things. We are in the midst of the action, and it's got a remarkably theatrical and stage-like setting. The actors, though, rather than human, are cervine. And believe me, I've waited a long time to use the deer equivalent of bovine, cervine. And this may have been one reason that the painting originally appealed to someone who was trained on the stage, William Dunlap. He was an actor, he was a producer, he was a playwright. And this painting does have a strong stage-like setting with the deer as its actors. Now, while Cole may have accentuated the character of this painting with its dead trees, and what we're seeing here is South Lake in the Catskills. This was not entirely his invention, or it is something that he actually would have witnessed at that time with his own eyes, though he may have heightened the effects of the dead and bare trees. As a number of scholars, maybe most notably Ken Myers, have pointed out, Silas Scribner's sawmill and dam were on Lake Creek between South Lake and Catterskill Falls. And in fact, we can see here's a much later view of the remains of the sawmill that can be found on a wonderful website to which Kevin Avery has contributed, that gives you a tour of all of the great locales in the Catskills painted by Hudson River School painters, which I recommend to you highly. But this is, the deadened trees were as a result of the changing water levels on South Lake, sometimes flooded, sometimes completely dry. And this caused many of the trees along the shore to die. The lumber mill, I should add, was extremely prosperous and is responsible for another leading feature of the Catskills, namely the lumber from Scribner's sawmill was used to build the Catskill Mountain House, as seen in Cole's 1848 work, which is, thanks to the Warner Foundation, presently on loan to the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, which is very, very exciting. There's perhaps, though, another reason another reason that can be thought of as the cause of the deadening of the trees, and that has been written about more recently by Tim Berenger and Jennifer Robb, as I will get to in just a moment. But there is early evidence of that other reason in a review that the painting received in December of 1825, shortly after it was exhibited for the first time. And that review reads, quote, "A late scene on the Catskill Mountain. Here Mr. Cole has exhibited talent and skill which entitle him to all the praise he has received. The group of girdled trees in the foreground, the still transparent green water, the sloping hill thickly covered with forest, the distant mountain tipped with beams of sun make the sky perfectly in unison, a mass of perfection in 2/3 of the composition. The remaining third has great beauties, but is not so perfect. 2 deer, apparently startled by some intruder's approach to this scene of solitude, might have been omitted, but nothing in the picture is truer to nature than the distant shore of the lake and the dead wood here and there, end quote. I should mention that the word girdle, the italics that you see in the quote before you are not my own. The italics appear on that word in the original passage. And girdling is a very specific term and would have been understood very specifically during that period to refer to the girdling of hemlock trees for tan bark. And I'm showing you an image of that practice whereby the bark was removed or stripped, girdled from the hemlock trees to provide a substance that was critical for the tanning of hides. And in their recent work on coal, an essay written by Tim Berenger and Jennifer Robb, both of Yale, entitled An Inheritance in Print, Thomas Cole and the Aesthetics of Landscape. Both Tim and Jennifer talk extensively about the tanning industry in the Catskill Mountains. It became the international center for the tanning industry. Cattle hides were shipped from South America and the Caribbean to the Catskills, and it created an incredible industry and many, many boom towns, including Prattsville, New York, which was home to the largest of the tannery founded by Zadock Pratt in 1825. But in the 20 years that Zadock Pratt owned and operated his tannery, it used 100,000 cords of hemlock bark coming from nearly 400,000 trees. For those of you who know about girdling, girdling usually results in the death of the tree. There are ways of getting it to come back after it's been girdled through grafting, but all 400,000 of those trees probably died, including the trees along the shore of South Lake. Now, what do we make of all of this? Where does this narrative conclude? If we think of hunters in the landscape as a departure, and if we think of the dead trees on the lake as being in the middle of the story, the narrative, when do the hunters return? And thinking back and remembering that exactly at the time these paintings were worked on by Cole, he was also painting or drawing sketches of scenes from Rip Van Winkle. Not just the one that I've already shown you, but these two as well, which are all in the collection of the Albany Institute. Think about the story of Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle undertook a 20-year sleep after imbibing in the liquor provided by the Dutchmen that he encountered in the mountains in the Catskills in much earlier garb, and he imbibed and he woke up 20 years later to a vastly changed world, a world no longer under the crown of King George III, but a post-Revolutionary War world where the tavern sign was replaced with a portrait of none other than George Washington. So he woke up in the young republic. I'd like to submit to you that perhaps the conclusion to this narrative, or the return of the hunters, as in the case of Rip Van Winkle, occurred exactly 20 years later when Thomas Cole painted The Hunter's Return, now in the collection of the Amon Carter Museum. Here we see two individuals coming out of the wood, carrying the bounty of their successful hunt, a deer strung up on a pole, not identical to the hunters that set out in 1825, but hey, it's been 20 years. So thinking about this scene, I would like to give Jack Warner his credit for making this connection in the first place. Jack did not own The Hunter's Return. That has been in the collection of the Amon Carter Museum for some time. However, he did own this study for The Hunter's Return, and he often displayed it alongside Hunters in a Landscape, precisely to create this narrative connection between the two images. So I would like to give credit where credit is due and acknowledge Jack Warner's insights, which was the first time I saw these two works brought together in this way. So 20 years later, The Hunters returned into a landscape that, as Thomas Cole put it in his 1836 essay on American scenery, was shaped by the, quote, ravages of the axe. Now, beyond the obvious clearing and cultivation of the once wild landscape, there are some other less obvious clues that possibly reveal Cole's own misgivings about America's course of empire. Let's take, for example, the cabbage patch. On one hand, the cabbage patch may be a clever signature, much like the fruit peel on the table in the famous portrait of the Peel family by Charles Wilson Peel in the collection of the New York Historical Society. From the late 18th through the mid-19th century, cabbage was commonly called cole or colewort in the English language, very similar to the German word for cabbage, Kohl, K-O-H-L. As an 1836 dictionary of the English language stated, Cole was, quote, a name for all sorts of cabbage, end quote. However, in the cultural milieu of Cole's time, the cabbage patch had become associated with commerce. And through the work of none other than Washington Irving, the cabbage patch became the site of the very sort of development that Cole feared the most. And the work by Washington Irving, to which I refer, is Wolfert Webert, or Golden Dreams, first published in 1824 under the pseudonym Geoffrey Crayon in Irving's Tales of a Traveler. And I'll read to you a passage from that work, which tells the story of an old Dutch patroon named Wolfert Weber, who had a vast cabbage farm, which he relied on for his own prosperity. And Irving writes, quote, "The chief cause of anxiety to honest Wolfert, however, was the growing prosperity of the city. The expenses of living doubled and trebled, but he could not double and treble the magnitude of his cabbages, and the number of competitors prevented the increase of price. Thus, therefore, while everyone around him grew richer, Wolfert grew poorer, and he could not, for the life of him, perceive how the evil was to be remedied." End quote. Well, he eventually found a very fine remedy for this evil, which put him, back in the black, so to speak. He sold his cabbage farm to real estate developers seeking to expand Manhattan. And in this later painting by John Quidor of 1857, now in the High Museum, we see Wolfert Webert on the right, dressed like a respectable patroon, smoking his long pipe and sort of basking in his own golden dreams, his newfound fortune in real estate development. So the cabbage had other implications associated with commerce and development during this time. While I don't have an image to allude to this story the way that I do with Washington Irving's work, cabbage also plays a central role in the 1839 short story by Edgar Allan Poe entitled The Devil in the Belfry, which was a satire directed at a descendant of the old Dutch patroons, Martin van Buren. And it tells the story of a town called Wonder What Time It Is, Wonder What Time It Is, whose inhabitants are concerned with only two things: clocks and cabbage. And in this town, cabbage stands in as a sort of a currency of sorts. It is synonymous with money and is therefore highly prized. Now, it's a bit anachronistic. It wouldn't come until later in the 19th century when green currency began to be known by the colloquial term cabbage. So that's a little bit of a footnote on the concept associating cabbage and commerce. But in conclusion, I'd like to quote Thomas Cole again, thinking about how this scene, which on the one hand may appear to be a very happy scene of family life and progress, how it does reveal some of his underlying fears of the course of the American empire and the rate of progress and the loss of the landscape and the idea of monetizing the landscape, which, especially if we consider my comments on cabbage, this scene becomes a little more insidious. In his work of 1841, The Lament of the Forest, he wrote, and dissonant, the axe unresting smoke, our reverend ranks and crashing branches lashed. The ground, the mighty trunks, the pride of years rolled on the groaning earth with all their umbrage. And then later writes, each hill and every valley has become an altar unto Mammon, and the gods of man's idolatry, the victims we. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, for that amazing talk.
And Betsy, I think you're coming on now, and we'll take questions.
Yes. Can you hear me? Thank you all for joining. And Graham, I cannot believe how many sources you found, ranging from Daniel Boone to cabbages. And this is an incredible example of the great research that you do. And so we will have a few minutes now to take questions. And I encourage everyone to send their questions through the Q&A feature. If you scroll your cursor down, you should see a Q&A button. And if you press on that, up should pop a window where you can type your questions. And I will read them aloud to Graham. Great. So, yeah, so go ahead and submit whatever's on your mind. In the meantime, I would like to know how on earth you found this cabbage idea. I just love this. And are there any other examples from that time period of using cabbages as this, you were talking about later time period, but as a stand-in for, in paintings, as a stand-in for commerce or money or anything like that?
Well, I haven't looked that closely yet, but I think I may be onto something. So I kind of worked backwards from I first discovered this concept through the later painting by John Quidor. I think I was working on a paper for Brian Allen when he was teaching at Yale. I was back for my doctoral program, and I wrote a paper on tropes of Dutchness in American art. And I ended up writing about Quidor's work, which it takes its inspiration from a number of Washington Irving stories. And then, looking at when that story was written, it was written in 1824, right when, Cole was working on the first work in this narrative that I'm proposing. But I think he certainly would have been aware of Irving's work and maybe this idea of, kind of cabbage kind of currency of sorts cropped up later, because we know from his drawings of Rip Van Winkle that he was aware of Washington Irving. I also think that Cole is, I can't rule out the idea that I've proposed that this is a sort of clever signature, because Cole was quite commonly used as a synonym for cabbage throughout his lifetime. And then it's, I think there's maybe, more to be discovered when looking at, the cabbage connection. I will add one thing though, that Cole himself wrote about cabbage in a letter to a patron. He wrote about it somewhat, sort of sneeringly, and it said something along the lines of, any young person that can paint a cabbage, they want to call him a genius. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the extent of the quote. So sort of the ability to paint a cabbage as a marker of, prodigy among young artists, I guess.
I love it. Well, Cole has been known to say that nothing in his paintings is arbitrary. Everything is carefully chosen. So
I believe that.
Got to take him at his word. So I have a couple other questions here piled up. One person would like to know, what was that website with the photo of the mill? I could answer that. That is our art trail website. We created the Hudson River School Art Trail and hired Kevin Avery to write the descriptions, and it's hudsonriverschool.org. And there you'll find maps and directions to a lot of these places that you can still visit today, including this one, North South Lake. So yes, Graham's put it back up on the screen.
It's a totally fabulous resource, and having written a lot about the Hudson River School, it is sometimes a real challenge with certain paintings to figure out exactly where they're painted. And I remember the last exhibition I worked on of the Hudson River School, we were borrowing from a lot of private collectors and borrowing works that necessarily hadn't been had received much attention. And sometimes we were trying to figure out what mountain range the works were even in. Are we looking at the White Mountains? Are we looking at the Catskills or even the Alleghenies? And I should mention that the journey, the 20-year journey that the hunters took started in the Catskills, but ended in the White Mountains, because in the background, that's Mount Chocorua in the background. Some of you probably noticed. So we've gone on quite a journey over those 20 years in the woods.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We luckily had an enormous amount of help with this website, getting people to help identify all the peaks and the rocks, and it was just a really fun project that they keep growing every year and adding sites. So let's see. A question from Sylvia Hassenkopf, who's been doing a lot of research on Thomas Cole recently, and she says, oops, let me see. Actually, someone has just taken it away from me. Hold on a second. View. Oh, for heaven's sakes! As I was just about to ask it, it went away. But what I believe it said was that she wanted to know what was the if we know who commissioned this painting and the story of its origin. Yeah,
we unfortunately don't. I discovered recently, I was corresponding with Kate Mencaneri, and there's a provenance that came in with this painting, and most of it is correct, but the first entry in the provenance is not correct. It said that it was commissioned for the price of $1,000 by a gentleman who, in fact, did not commission this work. He commissioned The Picnic, which Tim Berenger spoke about recently, for $1,000. At the time that this was painted, and it wasn't a commission, it's very, very early, it would have been painted and sold for about $25. That's what paintings this size in 1825 were sold for by Cole. So there's a lot of research yet to be done. And I think now that it is receiving this sort of attention with the many visitors and scholars that come through the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, it won't be long before we know more.
And Susan Warner, the giver of the painting, says, "Thank you, Graham. That was so marvelous and so informative. Jack is looking down and applauding. He appreciates your giving him credit for seeing what you saw." So,
thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. I miss Jack a lot, and I wish he were here with us to join us this evening. So I'm pleased he's looking down on us.
yeah, I'm glad I got to meet him and Susan before Jack died several years ago at the Olana event where they honored him with the Frederick Church Award. So got to meet him then. We have a question here from Liam Otterow, who says he's asking about the hay wain, and is it possible, this is Constable, known for his paintings conveying socio-political messages on rural modernization, and says it's possible that Cole's concerns about the monetizing of the landscape in The Hunter's Return was inspired by the socio-political messages in Constable's pictorial commentaries on the changes of the British countryside.
I think it's entirely possible. I wouldn't rule it out. I haven't gone that that direction or that deep. This is sort of a revived research interest. Lately, those of you who know what I've been working on lately, I've been writing about the Viking revival in the 19th century and the kind of false belief in the kind of major Norse culture in present day Cambridge. So it's a very sharp shift to returning to Cole, but I think that that's certainly something that could be explored very compellingly.
Yeah, and Cole and Constable were great friends, so it's entirely possible. So Alan Wallach had a similar question about the provenance, and he mentions that in 2003, Christie's traced the painting back to Alex Acevedo. So maybe we can follow up with Alex and find out what he knows.
I think Alex would be one place to look, and if someone can get their hands on Berry Hill's records, that would be another, because it was in their hands as well. So I think that would definitely be the next place to look.
But we have our 4 new Thomas Cole Fellows starting up soon, our research fellows. So maybe we can put them on the job now that we have them all hired. Let's see, what else do we have here? Let's see. This question from Brian Smith is about the sequential time connection between the painting of the hunters and the painting of Lake with Dead Trees with the deer. And he's postulated, could Cole be asking us to consider man's incursion into nature will ultimately result in the destruction of the beautiful forests, which Cole considered to be the manifestation of God's creative beauty and ability?
Absolutely. I think that's very well put. Cole would have experienced for himself the destruction on South Lake caused by the presence of man, caused by Silas Scribner's mill, as necessary as it was here's the irony of it. Cole would not have been there, likely, were it not for the tourism that rose in the Catskills, thanks to the ability of materials milled by Silas Scribner's mill. Yet that was what was causing the destruction on the lake. And I think that some people don't also realize that the dam that Scribner built effectively shut off the water coming over the falls, and that tourists had to pay for water to be released to come over the falls during the summer. I don't know how long that continued, but I've certainly read about that, which is sort of mind-blowing to me that even during this kind of age when I think some people thought of the Catskills and Catskill Fall as being more pristine than it actually was. It was actually so well touristed and rather managed. I won't go so far as to compare it with the theme park, but that's also, I've done work on the American West and the Yosemite Valley and Bierstadt, and what Bierstadt depicts as pristine, by the time he got there was already starting to, be littered with detritus from other tourists.
Yeah, I love that anecdote about having to pay for the falls to be falls.
Yeah.
And I understand that if you paid a little additional fee, they'd lower a bottle of wine down to you as well. So
that sounds rather nice.
Yeah, maybe they should revive that part.
I think that that's a very appropriate point to be made.
Susan had a follow-up question. She wondered if you could explain further the possible relationship between the two hunters, or if you had any idea about whether they had a relationship. What, are they discussing something? I'm adding words to her question here, but
well,
I wondered that too.
All that I can say is that they seem completely mismatched. They seem like, Felix Unger and Oscar Madison, the odd couple. And that has always struck me about that painting ever since I first saw it in 2006, because the figures, they're quite a bit larger than the other figures that you see in Cole landscapes. They're, a few inches tall, where typically his figures, and people can see my fingers, typically his figures are not much more than an inch large total when they're surrounded by a splendid landscape. And they just don't seem to go together, and that's where I started thinking about my previous work. The concept that I cited on Mount's work is actually my own research that was published in the Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness catalog that Yale published back in, 2009 or 10 or so. And so thinking about the democratizing influence of music, and I thought, well, this is, I know about Cole's anxieties about, democracy in Jacksonian terms, but, what about thinking about the forest as a sort of equalizer? Because in point of fact, for those of us who have ever spent any time in the woods, and I grew up in the foothills of the Cascades in Washington State. In fact, I grew up on a farm, and you look at the woods behind us on our farm, and I could see, the Cascade Mountains. So, and I spent a lot of time in the woods, and the woods is no respecter of, class or rank. It only matters, what your skills are. So it is a sort of great equalizer in a way. One of them seems ready for the woods, and the other, though, it doesn't quite seem to match the other. Now that's speculation, but that's part of the fun of these talks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just have a couple more here. One person asked, will a recording of this be available online? And yes, we have recorded this, and we will be putting it up on our website, thomascole.org, in our videos section shortly. And I think, how about we end with this question that I would like to know the answer also. An artist, Phil Koch, says, I know museum are loath to tell, but I wondered if you have a favorite among all of Cole's works.
Wow. Yeah, I think I'm a little biased, and thank you, Philip, for that question. Philip has been a regular viewer of my director's cut tours throughout the pandemic, so we've gotten to connect that way. I'm a little biased. One of the things that I admire about Cole is his exquisite skill as a draftsman. He did really detailed drawings of many of his subjects, and I wish I had included an image at the end, but here in the Birmingham Museum of Art's collection, we don't have a Cole painting, sadly, but we do have his largest extant drawing, a 6-foot wide panoramic view of Mount Etna, which is one of the most exquisite displays of draftsmanship I have ever seen of any artist of any period. It's a tour de force. So that may be a current favorite, but over the years, I've gotten to, bask in the light of so many Cole paintings that I think that changes from time to time. till I discover my new next favorite.
Graham, yeah, your curator was kind enough to show me that drawing when I was down there a year ago, and it was just unbelievable. Just you could spend hours finding things in that drawing. Well, thank you enormously, Graham, for this wealth of new scholarship. And I would just like to ask everyone who has enjoyed this program, we are able to offer free programming, and we hope so much that you would consider supporting us with a membership at thomascole.org/membership, or a donation of whatever you can at thomascole.org/donate. And thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Graham, and thank you, Susan Warner, for making all of this possible. Everyone have a good evening.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Real pleasure.